All right, you made it to the trench. And at the end of this message, I'm going to give you a little bit of a clue about how the Germans used trenches and a little bit about German trenches. But instead of sitting here and sort of describing the battle, I want to take a moment and talk about sort of life in the trenches. Um, the trenches were insanely smelly. You smelled them from miles away. And this was because there was the lingering smells of poison gas that would hang around days after an attack, even if it wasn't in any kind of lethal concentration. The smell of cordite and burned powder from explosives. And then you had cooking smells. And depending on where you were, if you were in Flanders with the British in particular, there was mud, and so you had the smell of mud for much of the year. And cooking smells. Latrines weren't great because the water table's pretty high, and so it would rain, and in your latrines, your toilets would basically your trench, outhouses would back up, and that stuff would float back out, and so you're smelling that. You're smelling the dead bodies, even if you bury them. There's an artillery bombardment. The bodies frequently get thrown back up. Um, and you're dealing with a life where there's like rats everywhere. All the veterans in the first couple of lines talk about being overrun by rats, and the rats getting pretty cheeky, and they would bite you if you were asleep, trying to figure out if you were actually dead. And apparently, the rats liked the eyeballs, and so that's what they went for first. So you have this sort of miserable existence, and you're with the same people that you're probably closer to than anyone else um, in your life, because your life depends on how well they do their jobs. But you are literally around the same group of guys for day after day, for weeks after weeks. You're eating together. It's usually the same food. It becomes very boring, and it seems weird to us that you're sitting in a trench where an artillery shell could come across at any moment and kill you, and yet you're bored. And one of the products of this boredom is trench art. So I'm going to show you a shell. This one happens to be a French 75 millimeter. This was sort of the standard shell. Originally, there would have been the actual shell, the actual part that goes boom in here. And this holds the shell and the powder that fires it from the cannon. And you can see here where this is, let me just turn it this way, where there's a lip back here, and that was designed so you fit this into the gun like this. You fired it, the gun hit this thing, which created the chemical reaction inside that exploded the powder, that sent the business part of this out of this sort of case and sent it flying to the enemy. And then this shell casing would then be thrown from the gun, and you can tell here there's a little bit of damage. That's where the artillery piece actually grabbed this and threw it out. And but the point is, the shell didn't look like this when it was fired, or even right after it was fired. But there would be literally millions of these laying around in big battlefields, and you could get them. And so soldiers from all countries bought little kits, and they turned these into art. Some of them are incredible, and they're in museums and art museums in Europe in particular. This one's a pretty simple, basic one. It's turned into a vase. You've got the column design. Then this ring around it would have actually been made from the inside, from working it from the inside, as with the crimping at the top. And you look at each of these little dots, and it looks like he had a tool that had about 6 dots. So every group of 6 of these little bitty dots had to be hand hit. And he put the decorations down here, and he thought enough of it that he brought it home or sent it home. This particular piece was made in 1917. So, so I give you some idea of you spending hours and the time going really slow, and then finding a way to try and pass time. So this one's a little longer than the other videos. I apologize. I did want to tell you that the Germans, by the time they got later in the war, by about 1916, they decided to use their trenches as what we call defense in depth now, where they kept very few troops in the front line. They kept a lot of troops in the second line. They kept a lot of troops in the third line. And then they kept a lot of troops all the way in the back. Not way in the back, but a couple of miles behind the front line. So the idea was, we're going to give up that first line pretty easily. We're going to try and hold the second and third line, but if they fall, we're going to be able to bring a lot of guys in fairly quickly, and we're going to counterattack and try and take whatever you take. So that was sort of how the Germans worked. So thank you.